Hi, Peter Charles here, and let's talk about auto ISO. I find when I talk to other photographers, not a lot of people use it, and some people don't even know what it is or what it does. So let's talk about auto ISO and how it can make a big difference in our photography. Okay, let's start off with what is auto ISO. Well, I'm assuming you know what ISO is. It's the sensitivity of the sensor. And you might set it at 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, or anything in between. All the way up to, 25,000. So it makes the sensor more sensitive to light, so we raise the ISO when our light levels drop, as an example. Well, what we can do with our cameras, we can set our ISO to automatic. And so the camera picks the ISO for us. So as an example, on this X100, Fujifilm X100, the ISO is set right in here, and there's a red letter A where I can choose to put it on automatic, or on this camera, my XS20, you can see I'll hit the ISO button, and you can see I can do it through the menu. And I have the ISO button right there. So I just punch that button up and it comes up on the screen. So you have the ability to go into your ISO, however you get it through a dial or through the menu. You can go in and pick out the A function, the auto ISO. Now, one of the big problems we have is that our cameras are not all consistent in how the ISO or the auto ISO is handled. The camera that's filming me right now, which is my Sony, it does not do a very good job of handling auto ISO. It just says basically it's on auto. So it's a bit like program mode. It just does what it does. You have really no control over it. With this particular camera, the XS20, in fact, all of the Fujifilm cameras, you can see there are three choices there for auto ISO. So you have the ability with the auto ISO in Fujifilm, to set a floor and a ceiling for your ISO, and you can choose to leave the shutter speed on automatic, or you can set a floor for the shutter speed. And how that works, if you're in program mode or aperture priority mode where the shutter speed is automatic, it will not go below that shutter speed without first increasing the ISO. So in other words, if you go into a low light situation and you need to say go down, you're at 1/125th and you need to go down to 1/30th, well, the camera won't go down to 1/30th, they'll start raising the ISO instead. So it sets a floor for your shutter speed and it sets a floor for your ISO. So you could set the minimum at 120, 125 or 100 and set the maximum, say 3200 as an example. In Fujifilm cameras, you usually have three of these settings that you can configure the way you like. So that's very handy. But as I say, not all cameras have really good auto ISO. Some of them just has auto and that's it. So the camera does what it does. So that's something to keep in mind. The usefulness of auto ISO depends on how well the implementation is done in your camera. So that's something worth checking in the manual if you're not sure how it works. So where does it come into play? Well, we've all got our mode dials here, right? And if you're in, program, that's cool. And shutter priority, aperture priority, manual. You can use auto ISO in all of them. And as I just described, it can keep your shutter speed from getting too low, which is a handy thing in program and aperture priority. Shutter priority, you're setting the shutter speed so you don't have to worry about it, but that's when you run out of aperture on either end, so you've opened up as far as you can or you've closed down as far as you can, the ISO will then adjust according to the needs of the situation. So you're letting the ISO do it instead of sitting there trying to fiddle. You're on automatic, but nevertheless, the camera is making a choice between, are we adjusting the shutter speed or adjusting the aperture, or are we adjusting the ISO? So instead of having two choices, you have three. Now what's cool, and this again depends on the camera, you have exposure compensation with ISO, automatic ISO, which gets very, very handy when you need to adjust the exposure. So your exposure is a little hot, you want to bring it down, you just use the exposure compensation. And again, it doesn't always work with all cameras. Older Fujifilm bodies, it didn't work. But on these newer bodies, the auto ISO, you can use exposure compensation on the auto ISO. On these cameras with the traditional control layout, it's very easy to do. You have to know a little bit more when you come to these. There's a little bit more fiddles involved. Now, where's the big fun? Where it gets really interesting? Well, where it gets really interesting is when you're on manual. Okay, so this one's set to f11, 1/500th of a second. That's typically what I'm shooting when I'm out and doing street photography. I use 1/500th of a second to freeze action. I'm using f11 to get depth of field. But what happens if I move from a sunny situation to a shady situation? Or I camp out in front of a dark alleyway waiting for somebody to step in front of it. I have to meter for the person that's going to be in the sunlight walking down the sidewalk and not meter for that dark background. So you can say I could put it in manual, but sometimes you need that auto function. So I put it on auto ISO and I use my my exposure compensation. I'm going to say that all day, aren't I? You're going to use your exposure compensation to darken or lighten the image to get the exposure you're looking for. So you're letting the ISO drift all over the place, because in street photography, it's more about getting the shot. It's not about getting absolute pristine perfection in the image in terms of its technical quality. It's about getting the shot. If you've ever seen some of the old street photographers like Henri Cartier-Bresson, I mean, some of his stuff, you could say, it's a little soft. It's not that sharp. Could have done a better job at that. But it's not that. It's about getting the shot. So when you're in a situation where it's more important to get the shot than to get pristine technical quality, the auto ISO works beautiful. Another thing I do is with my X-T2, and I'm using my 150 to 600, I'm doing birds, I'm doing exactly the same thing. The camera's on manual, the ISO is set to auto, and but it comes in with an interesting little wrinkle. With the X100, I've got enough dials. I've got aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and exposure compensation. So I've got enough dials to do everything. In this camera, I can run out of dials to control everything. I could lose my exposure compensation, but if you go into the menu on this camera, you can control what these command dials do. So you set your aperture ring that handles aperture all of the time. That's shutter speed or nothing, and the back dial is exposure compensation all of the time. That works on the XH2. It doesn't work on the XS20. It does not have enough customization available for the command dials. So that may be another factor. If you have this DSLR style camera, you may not have the dials to do auto ISO in manual mode and have exposure compensation. That's again something to check into. But I will say this, it's probably the best way to work when you need to control your camera and you need something to be on automatic. So when you put it on manual and you use auto ISO, you can control the shutter speed, you can control the aperture, you can nail those so they don't change. And you're just letting the ISO drift where it needs to go. But then when you need to darken a subject or lighten a subject because of the lighting conditions, you can use your exposure compensation. And it applies to the auto ISO, and your shutter speed and your aperture don't change. So wildlife photography, street photography, anything like that, it's fantastic. Even in the studio or shooting models, we were using available light. When available light in the studio, that's very handy. You position the model differently, your exposure has changed. And if you're working 100% on manual, you better be paying attention. So that's another area where that auto ISO can save your bacon, is your lighting is subtly changing as the model is moving from one side of the room to another, and you're not having to constantly keep up with manual mode. So you know, I'll just put up some of the cameras I've used over the years. I've been using manual cameras, adjustable cameras, since 1969, all the way from 35 millimeter, medium format, large format, used all sorts of manual cameras. So I'm as tuned to manual photography as you can get. But when I am out shooting birds or I'm out on the street, I'm using auto ISO. Everything else is, well, focus is not manual, but my aperture, my exposure is manual, and I've got auto ISO to allow the cameras to make some decisions, and I use the exposure compensation to adjust. So that for me is the big thing, is using the camera on manual aperture, manual shutter speed, but then putting the ISO on automatic and letting it drift. And then once you've got the exposure compensation in there, man, can you take control of situations. And you don't have, you've got the benefits of being on manual without having to constantly pay attention to your light meter and constantly adjust as your subject is moving in and out of different lighting conditions. It's great. It's great. And I love using it. So if you have not used auto ISO before, give it a try. I think it'll make a difference. Cheers.